Hello, everybody. I'm back for the second part of the eliminative materialist, or as I said in class today, materialist, because I can't speak and it's hard. So basically what we did in class today was that we talked about the Churchland article and looked at his argument for why we should get rid of ordinary folk psychology notions like beliefs and desires and replace them all with brain talk. And so just an overview of what we'll be talking about today. Here's the plan. We'll start with a little overview. Then I'm going to be doing a little background about notions that philosophers use, types, tokens, and states. Then we're going to talk about reviewing the eliminative discussions from today. And I'm going to do it in terms of talking about states, just so we can use this new term to make sense of it more. Then I'm going to start arguing against the materialist position. And I'm going to start by talking about dogs and Martians, and then I'm going to be talking about plastic brains. And by plastic here, I mean it's easy to change, like plasticity, not that it's literally made out of plastic. And then I'm going to talk about a response that some materialists might try to give and why that argument is not necessarily a good one. So that's going to be the game plan. And so just to highlight here, after today's lecture, it might have seemed like there was this view, materialism, that had some good things to say about ordinary folk psychology and why it's wrong. And therefore you might think like, oh, if this is a view, a lot of people in psychology have adopted it. But the fact is most psychologists today and people working in psychology and also in cognitive science, pretty much most of them reject Churchland's view. Most of them think we do need notions like belief and desires and hopes and feelings and everything else if we're going to give a scientific explanation of human beings and human mental stuff. And so what I'm going to do in this section is explain what one of the major arguments against materialism is. And this argument is often called either the multiple instantiation argument or multiple realizability argument. And basically what this argument is going to say is that eliminativism isn't general enough. If we want to explain things that are useful or interesting, we need to keep folk psychology around because notions like beliefs and desires are more general and apply to larger sets of people and animals and organisms than do brain states. And if we try to explain everything in terms of brain states, the sorts of laws and explanations we get aren't actually going to be that interesting and aren't going to explain all that much. So that's going to be like the general idea behind that. Of what we're going to do today is just explain this one of the most popular arguments against materialism. All right, so that's the overview. So now, there are many different versions of this same argument that can be found in the literature, and you can find other discussions of them. The one I assigned is by Ned Block and Jerry Fodor, and they are two very important people within cognitive science. We'll be talking about them again later in the semester, especially Fodor. But basically, to understand how their argument against materialism works, it's first worth talking about some of these terms which they use, because they frame things in terms of talk of types and types of states. And so it's useful just to say what these are. And these are also just useful terms to have, especially if you're taking other philosophy classes or just generally trying to understand how things work. If you can understand types and tokens and that sort of thing, and also what we mean here by state, it's just a useful thing. So this is just a little background bit that'll make it easier to explain stuff later. So the first thing is types and tokens. So these are really so the best way to understand what types and tokens are is these are kind of a theoretical tool or a way of speaking about things that just allows you to keep things careful. So, or keep things clear so you can speak more carefully. So if I say the Ford Focus is the best car, it's unclear whether I'm talking about a particular Ford Focus, like my own car, or whether I'm talking about the entirety of Ford Focuses as a model. Or if I say philosophy is the best class, am I saying all philosophy classes are the best, or am I just talking about one particular philosophy class you happen to be taking being the best? And so to clarify and keep things simple, philosophers often talk about types and tokens. So you can think about a token as an individual. And types are really groupings of individuals that have things in common or share properties. So if I'm talking about a token human is someone like me. If I'm talking about the type humans, I'm talking about all human beings and things that are general about them. So why is this useful? Because if you talk in terms of types, you can say things that are meant to apply to all tokens. So you can think of individual tokens as, in some sense, instantiating or being an example of the type. So for instance, I am a token of the type human being. And knowing that I'm a token of the type human being allows you to know certain things about me. For instance, that I walk on two legs. Knowing that I'm a token of that type allows you to assume with high probability that I'm walking with two legs. Again, there's always a chance I have lost a leg or I wasn't born with two legs, but most of the time that's the case. Also, if you know that I'm a token of the type human, you know that I almost certainly know how to use a human language. You also know that I have color vision. These are all things that you can, knowing that I'm a token of this type, know. But then there are things about me as a particular token that separates me from other token human beings. And so, for instance, where I'm born separates me from other token humans, what exactly I look like. But there are other things that, because I'm a human, I almost certainly have two eyes, I speak, I have teeth, yada, yada, yada. So why is this talk of types and tokens useful? Because we can talk about things, using talk of types allows us to categorize and group things together in ways that are explanatorily useful. And one of the things that we can talk about as being of the same type, or to use Fodor and Bloch's terminology, type identical. And to say something is type identical is just to say that two tokens are type identical, which means that they are of the same type, or they're identical with respect to a particular type. And one of the things that we can talk about in this case are states. So what do I mean by a state? And I don't mean like New York or Missouri or etc. What I mean by a state here is it's a way of being. And so a state is one of the types of things that verbs can pick out. So in class, early on in English class or grammar class, they teach you about the different, like nouns pick out persons, places, and things, and adjectives pick out like properties or things that a thing can be. Well, and verbs pick out actions. Well, they don't just pick out actions. Verbs can also pick out states. So for instance, a state is going to be something like the state of being asleep. So sleeping isn't really an action, or being asleep. Being asleep is not an action, it's a state. So being asleep is a state. Also being conscious or being aware, these are states. So all we mean by a state is like a state of affairs or a way things are. And it's like, it's extended through time and it's not doing something or accomplishing something, it's a being. So all we mean by a state is being. So for instance, I always have trouble thinking of examples of states. So for instance, being happy is a state. You are in a state of happiness. That's a state. If I'm like jumping around with joy, that's an action, but a state of happiness. So types of states include things like consciousness. So if we have two people and they're both asleep, they are in the same state, namely asleepness. That's all we mean by type, token, state. And I'm bringing this up again because it's a useful thing that's going to come up throughout the semester. And it's also just a useful thing. So if you want to make sure you're speaking clearly in your everyday life, think about things in terms of types or tokens. Say, my dog's the best dog, or dogs are the best. Are you talking about your particular dog, your token dog, or are you talking about the types of dogs? And keeping it clear, because sometimes people, it's easy to switch from one to the other. So if I say Ford Focuses or like my Ford Focus is the best, therefore are you saying that it's best for the type of Ford Focus, or are you just saying it's the best for everything? Again, this is just useful clarification. And I bring this up because Bloch and Fodor begin their article by talking in terms of type identical. And now, with this in mind, now that we know what I'm talking about with types and tokens, it's useful to then jump over here, because this is useful because we can explain the argument between materialists and people who are supportive of folk psychology in terms of what sorts of state types are needed when giving an explanation of human beings. So, folk psychology, as we said, holds that the sorts of things, there are functional states, and again, a state is just a way of being. So there are functional states that are true of organisms or apply to a whole organism that we need to explain behaviors. So these are states like being in the state of believing something. So when we say, I believe that dogs are cute, or actually this should be different. I believe that dogs are cute. This is a state. I'm in the state of believing this. And so a folk psychologist says that we have these functional states, and believe is going to be defined functionally, is as I, as an individual, stand in a certain mental relation or a mental state to the proposition, again, propositional attitudes, that dogs are cute. I can't spell. So somebody who is supportive of folk psychology in our everyday lives, we explain things in terms of being in these mental states. So to believe something is to be in a particular mental state. And what a materialist is going to say is, no, we get rid of mental states and instead speak in terms of brain states. So instead of saying, I believe that dogs are cute, I say, I'm in brain state, blah, 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 where this is going to be some fancy neuroscience explanation of there's activation in the lower left hemisphere peaking at 300 milliseconds after the presentation of a stimulus, blah, 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 blah. So the idea is that instead of speaking in terms of brains or of mental states and saying that things act the same way because they are in two tokens of the same mental state, a materialist is going to say things act the same when they're in two tokens of the same type of brain state. So this is just a way of, this talk of types and tokens is useful for explaining where the debate between a materialist and somebody who's supportive of folk psychology or most cognitive scientists, where the debate falls. The debate is in terms of what type of states should we be talking about. When we say that two individuals behave in the same way because we want to know why two individuals are behaving the same way or why they are doing the same sorts of things. Well, one explanation is you say they're in the same type of mental state. They believe the same thing. And that's going to be the folk psychology explanation. A materialist says, no, throw that out. And for exactly the reasons we said before, we throw it out because the two reasons were, one, folk psychology doesn't get us that much. And the idea is that it's not nearly as successful as people often think. And two, that folk psychology looks a lot like other failed sciences. And instead, we're going to replace it with this other sort of thing, speaking in terms of neuroscience and brain states. So that's just the background of what we've talked about so far and how it can be explained in terms of states and types of states. And really, all of this is just unpacking something which Fodor and Block say very early on in their article. It's almost like one of the first few paragraphs. That's the background. So the question here is, who's right? If we're trying to explain behavior, do we want to do it in the folk psychology in terms of functional mental states, things like beliefs and desires and intentions and hopes, or do we want to follow the materialists and say, no, we do it all in terms of brain states and physical states and things like that? So the question here, and we finished last time by saying that the materialist thinks this is the way to go. You do it in terms of brain states. And part of their argument was, we might not have neuroscience that's successful yet, but we've seen a lot of progress in neuroscience. We know which parts of the brain are generally correlated with certain sorts of things. For instance, there are parts of the left side of the brain that in right-handed people are very closely associated with language use. And if you get damage to those parts of the brain, people don't use language in the perfect way. There are also cases in which there's a very particular parts that run along here that control your movement. So if you actually like poke a monkey in that part of the brain, their arms will move. If you were to take it and cut someone's head open and electrify that part of the brain, they'd start feeling things. There's another part where if you were to start touching it here, somebody's going to start seeing colors. And so the idea that the materialist has is this is good evidence that we're going to eventually be able to explain human behavior and everything else in terms of neuroscience. And so therefore, because we know that there are some, or because it looks like there might be some issues with ordinary folk psychology, and we've seen great breakthroughs in neuroscience, let's just assume it's neuroscience, stop worrying about mental states and everything else like that, and just talk in terms of types of brain states. So that's where we finished the first class. Now, however, we're going to look at the response that a lot of folk psychologists, or people who like to begin or believe there's something true about folk psychology, respond to this with. And they say, instead of questioning the idea that folk psychology isn't perfect and there are things that it doesn't get perfectly right, the way that this argument goes, this multiple instantiation argument, is it questions this idea that neuroscience is ever going to be able to get us what we want from a psychology. Because remember, the materialists are saying we might not be there yet, but there's good reason to be optimistic that one day neuroscience is going to give us everything we could possibly want when explaining behaviors. The folk psychology side of it says, no, it doesn't. And there's a lot of reasons to think that at the end of the day, neuroscience is never going to be able to get us what we want. It might be able to explain a lot, but the problem is it's never going to get us there. And so that's what I want to talk to about the this argument, this multiple realization or multiple instantiation argument against materialism. So it's up here, it's written dogs and Martians. Now, the way this argument goes is that you say, if you want to give a full psychology in which you understand the world, there are certain things that apply across organisms and even across not just individual organisms, but across whole species, and maybe even aliens could be included in this if such things were to be discovered. And it seems like we want to characterize these sorts of beings in the same way that we characterize human beings. So if I tell you, if you see a child and the child goes behind the couch and is crawling around on all fours and looking under the couch, you might ask me, why are they doing it? And I say, oh, they believe their ball fell behind the couch. That's one thing I might say and describe this child. Here's another thing that can be another thing that might do this exact same behavior or something very similar is a dog. A dog might go behind the couch and kind of climb under the couch. You might be like, why is the dog under the couch? And I'm tempted to say, well, it's because the dog believes its ball's under the couch, or the dog thinks its ball is under the couch. Or you might see a parent who goes behind the couch, crawls under, and you'd be like, why is that parent crawling under the couch? You say, they think that their child dropped the ball under there, or they believe there's a ball under there that they have to get. It seems like in all three of these cases, there's something common to the child, the dog, and the adult. Namely, that they're all in this same functional state. They all believe the same thing. Now, the problem here for a materialist is, how is a materialist, what sort of materialist explanation is there going to be? They're going to say something like, well, the dog, if you want to understand why the dog's doing what it's doing, it's in dog brain state, blah, 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 where there's activation in this part of the dog brain. And what about the child? Well, they're in a child brain state with certain activations, and that's why they're doing what they're doing. And the adult is in a certain activated brain state. And the problem is that if you're a materialist, dog brains, human adult brains, and child brains are in a lot of important ways different from each other. So the issue that someone who likes folk psychology is going to say is, here from the folk psychology perspective, we have a very strong general claim that we can make. Namely, that all three of these organisms despite their physical differences, despite their differences in their brains, there's something common to them all. And if we want to predict their behavior and we want to understand what they're doing, we talk in terms of folk psychology notion of belief. If we want to say that and explain what they have in common, talking in terms of brain states gets messy because dog brains, adult brains, and child brains are all importantly different. And so if you're talking about which part of the brain is firing or how it's firing, it seems like you're not going to be able to do that in a way that captures what is common to the three creatures, because the child, the adult, and the dog have different brains, and different parts of their brains will probably be being activated at those times. And what makes things even messier is you can imagine a Martian that doesn't even have a brain. Like imagine that Martians or like farther away aliens from the other side of the universe come here. And this alien from the other side of the universe doesn't have a brain in any way we can say. You can even imagine like the creatures made out of metal. It was like, even if it was originally it was constructed by someone, and now it's a very intelligent computer being, and it runs off of metallic somethings that fire in ways that, and it's not electrified, it uses water pumps within its metal innards. And so it's not going to be in a brain state because it doesn't have a brain. But you could imagine this creature or this thing doing things like looking behind the couch for a ball. And so a folk psychologist is going to say, all right, they might not have a brain, they might not even be made of the same stuff we are, but it still makes sense to say this being is looking behind the couch because they believe there's a ball under the couch and they want that ball. It seems like this sort of explanation is not open to the materialist. The materialist is going to have to say, whatever that alien's doing, it's something completely different from what adult humans do, because adult humans do things in terms of brain states. And if we want to give full scientific explanations, we're going to do it in terms of brain states. But this thing doesn't have a brain, so whatever it is, it cannot be in the same type of state as a human, because the right sort of state to describe is a brain state, and this thing doesn't have a brain. So just to put it in a different term, what folk psychologists and people who are supportive of folk psychology say is, if we're going to capture these universal generalizations, and it seems like if we know, like if we are trying to predict, is this creature going to go behind the couch and look for a ball? It seems like being able to say it believes there's a ball behind the couch is something that applies equally well to the dog, to the human adult, to the human child, and to the alien. And it seems like if we can allow ourselves to speak in terms of beliefs, then we have a lot of explanatory power and can give an explanation of why all four of these different creatures, despite their various physical differences, all behave in generally the same way. And the reason why is we can say they're all in the same functional state. So this gives us a lot of explanatory power that you cannot get if you're a materialist. If you're a materialist and you're only allowed to talk in terms of brain states, it seems like you cannot capture generalizations about why things do what they do that ordinary folk psychology can. So if we go back to what we said in the previous class, when we were saying that one of the things that folk psychology, one thing that materialists say is that folk psychology doesn't cover enough ground. It doesn't tell us everything. It cannot explain color vision. It cannot explain hand-eye coordination. Well, now the folk psychology supporters kind of flipping that on its head and saying, all right, materialist, we might not be able to explain that stuff, but you can't even explain what a dog and a human being behaving in much the same way, or an adult and a child behaving in much the same sort of way. You can't explain or give a general rule for why they're behaving in the same way. I, a folk psychologist, can say there's this thing, belief, and it covers both of them. They both believe it. Maybe that belief gets instantiated in different ways, and this is why it's called the multiple realizability or multiple instantiation argument. The idea is that the same exact belief could be instantiated or realized in different systems. So in the same way that a mousetrap can be, made out of plastic or metal, it looks like beliefs can be instantiated in brains, or maybe in this alien computer, or in a brain much less complex than ours. And it seems like if we allow ourselves to say that the same thing can be instantiated in different systems, then we can explain things and capture generalizations that couldn't be captured if we talk entirely in terms of brain states. So just to highlight, the turnaround, the folk psychology turnaround here is to say, all right, you're right, you might be able to give a characterization of brain states, but that's never going to be scientifically useful. We don't want to just explain what's going on in the head when human beings do this. We want to be able to, if we're going to understand behavior, we're going to want to be able to say what is in common between dogs and humans and possibly aliens. And so this is something that the materialist lacks. And so that's one of the main reasons that this functionalist type of folk psychology is so popular and so, like, why so many people reject the Churchland's view that we can do things in terms of brain states, because they say there are things that if you do in terms of brain states, you're not going to be able to give a scientific explanation that is general enough to explain the sorts of behavioral similarities we want to explain in something like psychology. You want to be able to say why this child who went through this traumatic experience and this adult who went through a similar traumatic experience behave in similar ways, even though they have very different brains. And it seems like if you do it in terms of beliefs, you can say this person believes that they're worthless, and this person believes that they're worthless. But you can't explain in terms of brain states, because this adult's brain and this child's brain are so different, because there are different stages of development, that there is no one brain state they share. So that's the general gist of the argument in terms of dogs and Martians. Now, at this point, if you have materialist leanings, one thing you might say is that, all right, you're right, we can't explain things in terms of brain states that are true of all species. We're not going to be able to capture dogs, and we certainly can't capture aliens, but you know what? Who cares? What we want to understand is human behavior. We want to be able to say why humans do what they do, how human minds work, or human brains work. And we don't care about dogs or Martians or anything like that. So you know what? Fine, functionalist, throw those out. We still think that you can explain human behavior in terms of brain states. And yes, while children and adults are different, if we actually look, there are important similarities that you could probably argue that a child and adult can be in similar enough brains, like token states, to count as tokens of the same type. And this is where the plastic brain comes in. And this is to say that, all right, this is something a folk psychology supporter might say. They might say, all right, let's even put aside the dogs and put aside the Martians. Even so, you still aren't going to be able to characterize the similarities in adult human behaviors that you want to capture in psychology in terms of brain states. And the reason not is because we've seen all the ways in which the human brain is an incredibly malleable and changeable and plastic sort of system that is able to change and adjust in response to environmental conditions or trauma in a way that two people's brains are almost never organized in precisely the same way. And even when somebody's brain is organized in a completely different way, it seems like we still want to be able to say this person is acting or in the same state as somebody with a very differently structured brain. And this is something that if you're talking only in terms of brain states, you can't capture. So to give a concrete example to make this make a little more sense, most right-handed people, and here's another interesting thing, that how your brain is organized and what parts of the brain are doing what, which side certain things happen in, is very closely tied to what hand you are. So if you are right-handed, there's in the left side of your brain are the parts of your brain which are most closely associated with language. So for instance, knowing that something is a grammatical sentence, or knowing that it's a word you recognize, whenever you do that, there are certain parts of the brain that activate, which suggests those parts are involved. And it's almost always, in most adult human beings, it's on the left side if a person's right-handed. However, they found that if a right-handed child has their brain damaged very early in life, so they say they have a tumor and a large part of their brain has to be taken out, or they get in an accident and part of their brain dies and atrophies, The fascinating thing is, if someone is a child, very often the things which are usually done in the left side of the brain start to be done by the right side takes over and somehow recognizes, and of course it's not like literally doing this, but something about the brain recognizes like, oh, the usual systems used for language aren't up because part of the brain's missing. We need to take over. And what will happen is this person will generally become totally fluent and successful in a language. They may have a couple little tics here and there, but if you met them on the street, you'd have no idea they weren't a fluent speaker of the language. It's not like they aren't. They are a fluent speaker of the language. You'd have no idea that they were doing things differently from you. You'd say, this person is speaking just like I'm speaking. This person has the same, when they say something's grammatical and I say something is grammatical, we both believe that thing is grammatical. But the fascinating thing is, for the person who's missing the left half of their brain, they are in a fundamentally different brain state than the person who's got the complete brain. You cannot say in terms of brain states that this person who's missing half their brain is in the same brain state as someone who's not missing any of their brain. And yet it seems like intuitively, or what a folk psychologist would say is, well, the reason that we're able to say they're doing the same thing is because they're in the same mental state. They have the same belief. They have the same desire. And because of this, we're able to predict that they're going to respond in the same way because they are functionally organized. Even if they have different instantiations of that system, they are in the same mental state, even if they're not in the same brain state. And it seems like this is something we want to say. We want to say that a right-handed person and a left-handed person, or a right-handed person who's lost part of their brain and a right-handed person who hasn't lost any of their brain are in the same mental state. And it seems like we want to say they're in the same state of mind, and that explains why they behave in the same way. But if you try to say that mental states throw them out, instead, we want to say that these two creatures are behaving, these two people, the one who's missing half a brain and the one who's not, are behaving in the same way, in a materialist way. We'd say they're in the same brain state, but that's blatantly false. These two people have different brains to such a degree that they cannot, by their anatomy means they cannot be in the same brain state. Only one person can activate the left side of their brain because only one of the two people has the left side of the brain. However, so it looks like the issue here is, here's a fact that ordinary folk psychology can capture that a materialist cannot. A folk psychologist can come along and say, look, we can say these two organisms behave in the same way because they have the same beliefs. They believe the exact same thing. Therefore, we can predict, because they both believe this sentence is grammatical, they both will understand what sentence this is. It doesn't matter what's going on in their brain. A materialist has to say, even though these people are in different brain states, therefore, it looks like we lose the ability to say what these two people have in common. A materialist is going to have to say they're in two different brain states, and those two brain states just so happen to lead to the same output or the same behaviors. And so you're losing a lot of explanatory power if you're trying to explain things in terms of brains. And as a matter of fact, there's a lot of evidence that no two adult human beings' brains are exactly the same, depending on what order we learn things in, because the way that your brain gets rewired and things is you just do stuff. And by using certain pathways in the brain, certain neurons get stronger and connections get bigger. And so basically, if you're doing a ton of math, what's generally found is that part of the brain that activates when you're doing math gets a lot more, the neurons there get stronger, you get more connections. And so it looks like if you're going to say things in terms of brain states, the problem is every single individual human being has a slightly different brain. So it looks like if you're saying that, why did this person do that? Well, they were in brain state blah. Well, it looks like you're going to have to give a different explanation for every single person in a certain sense, because every single person has a slightly different brain, and thus every single person is capable of a slightly different brain state. So this is the second issue, is you say, because brains are so plastic and they can change, it looks like somebody who says we do things in terms of brain states runs into this issue of everybody's going to be in slightly different brain states. Therefore, it looks like you lose all the generalizations of explaining human behavior. You can no longer say that one human adult and a dog and a Martian and somebody who lost half their brain in an accident when they were a child are all looking for a ball behind the couch for the same reason. What a materialist has to say is that each of these organisms is looking for a ball behind the couch for a slightly different reason. Namely, each one of them is in a different brain state, and each one of those brain states that they are in happens to bring about the same behavior. But you're no longer able to say there's something in common between all of them because we've said beliefs don't exist. All that we can talk about as a materialist is brain states, and because these brains are different, the states they're in are different. Now, one of the things that is often said at this point by people with materialist leanings is they go disjunctive. And what do I mean by disjunctive? Well, disjunctive is just to say something's a disjunction is just to say it's an or statement. So for instance, a disjunction of, you could give a disjunctive answer to what type of animal that is. So I could say, I can't quite see that, but that's either a cow or a horse or a donkey or a pigeon. I don't know how I'd confuse a cow with a pigeon, but just roll with it. So that's what a disjunctive answer is. So one thing a materialist might say is, all right, you're right. We can't give a complete account in terms of single brain states. We can't say what particular brain state causes a behavior, but we can give a disjunctive answer. We can say that a person will act in this way if they're like, a person will look behind the couch for a ball if they are in brain state 1 or brain state 2 or brain state 3, etc. So you might say like, oh, in this case, maybe we can't do it in terms of a single brain state, but maybe we can still do it in terms of brain states. We just give this disjunctive answer. And the response to this that the person supportive of folk psychology says is, where do you draw the line? How is this useful? As soon as you say you could be in this state or 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 this state, it seems like because every brain is slightly different, all you're saying is every single possible brain state that any organism could be in that could lead to this behavior is the brain state they might be in at that time. And it looks like you might want to say like, oh, well, technically true. If you're in this brain state or this brain state or this brain state, you're going to look behind the couch. But how is that very useful or explanatorily powerful? Remember, the goal of a scientific law or a science is good when it gives general statements. It's not like this marker is going to fall either because it's gravity or because I want it to, or because it wants to, or because I told it to. It's rather you want something general like it's going to fall because gravity. So in the same way, you want to give why did this person look behind the couch? Because, and you give a specific answer. So if you could say, it looked behind the couch because it's in this one particular brain state, and if it's in this brain state, it will look behind the couch for a ball, and if it's not in this brain state, it will not look. That would be a good materialist answer. But what somebody who is supportive of the folk psychology functionalist view is going to say is, this is impossible. You cannot give a one statement. The best you're going to be able to do, because every brain is a little bit different, is give this sort of disjunctive answer, either this or this or this. And so that's not very satisfying. So just to review this view, the whole picture, or everyday view is one on which what determines why we behave the way we do is there are these mental states we're in, beliefs, desires, hopes, intentions. And there's a fact of the matter of which of these states we're in. And each of these causes us to function in it plays a certain functional role in our mental lives. And these things cause us to behave the way we do. I get an umbrella because I don't want to get wet and I believe it's going to rain. The materialist comes along and says, this talk of belief, desire, you might do it in your everyday life, but it's not a good way of doing it. What we should do is throw it out and move towards neuroscience and giving neuroscientific explanations for why things happen. Then the functionalist comes back and says, all right, if that's true, then if we want to be able to give these general neurological, we should eventually, even if we can't do it yet, we should eventually be able to give these neuroscientific explanations for why things do what they do. Things look behind the couch when they are in this particular brain state. And what the folk psychologist says is, we are never going to be able to give a satisfying explanation in terms of neuroscientific in terms of brains and other neuroscientific concepts, because human brains are so unique in each individual and are so different from other sorts of organisms that could be, we would characterize as having minds, that speaking in terms of brain states doesn't get us what we want. We want to be able to explain things in law-like ways that capture why dogs and adults and children and possibly aliens and someone who's missing half their brain all go and look behind the couch for the ball that they believe is under the couch. And the idea is that materialism's never going to get you that, because if you limit yourself to brain science, brains are so different from one another that you're never going to be able to characterize things in a general enough way. So that's really one of the major reasons why so few people in cognitive science and why so many people still accept folk psychology and why so many people in cognitive science do not accept materialism. They just think that materialist explanations are never going to be general enough to capture the similarities in creatures that are different from each other or have slightly different organized brains. So hopefully that made sense. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, feel free to shoot me an email. We can set up office hours, anything like that. I will be putting up a little response question to something that is related to materialism in the next day or so. And again, just respond to it on the Blackboard. It's going to be another one of those ones where there's not a right or wrong answer. As long as you answer it, you will almost certainly get a check. So again, if this didn't make sense at all, just contact me. Hopefully that did make sense though. So I will see you all on Tuesday. Have a great rest of your week.